How did a single congregation grow to become one of the largest and most influential churches in America, only to experience a cataclysmic decline that placed its very existence in doubt? How did that same church endure a brutal and painful season of change to emerge from the transition stronger, more united, and more committed than ever to Jesus' Great Commission? I want to tell you this story. This is a story about the way ministry is changing in a new and harsher world, painfully different than the one known by our parents and grandparents. It's a story for pastors who face the daunting task of leading their churches through necessary but excruciating seasons of transition so they can move from surviving to thriving. This is a story for people who are part of those churches and experiencing the profound loss, the painful heartbreak, and the intense frustration that always comes with change. This is the story of what happened at First Baptist, the rise, ruin, and restoration of one of America's great churches. On April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sank. It struck an iceberg and was at the bottom of the ocean in just a few hours. In that tragic wreck, over 1,500 people were killed, and as of today, it is still the worst maritime disaster that has ever happened at a time of peace.
The so-called unsinkable Titanic striking an iceberg and plunging into the North Atlantic. Of the 2,200 people on board, 1,500 were killed. It had been a high-priced, high-society voyage. 10 of the passengers millionaires, and in the ship's vaults, $7 million in diamonds.
The amazing thing about the sinking of the Titanic on its maiden voyage is that it had been billed as unsinkable. It was the world's finest ship, it was the world's newest ship, and it was supposed to be the world's strongest ship. And yet, it is now a wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. How could the finest crew on the world's finest ship sink it on its maiden voyage? Well, numerous investigations have created a number of conclusions leading to the eventual demise of the Titanic. The captain steamed too fast into dangerous iceberg territory, everybody agrees. The ship definitely ignored warnings about severe iceberg problems that night from another ship in the area called the Californian. Another explanation is that of a cold water mirage. You might not know what this is, but a cold water mirage is basically the opposite of a warm air mirage. If you see a mirage in the desert because of warm air, what the mirage effectively does is it reflects the sky down onto the ground so that it looks like sea on the ground. It looks like water on the ground. But a cold water mirage does the opposite. It stretches the sea up towards the sky, and it actually limits your visibility and obscures obstacles on the way. A cold water mirage is one theory why the finest crew could not see the iceberg that they were headed right for until it was too late. Regardless of the specific explanation or the combination of explanations, the greatest ship in the world found it impossible to change direction with enough time to avoid tragedy. The point is that a failure to change course is deadly for ships, and it's deadly for churches. In this episode, we're going to look at several factors about change, what kinds of changes you need to make in your ministry, why that change is so hard, how to make decisions about those changes, and what some of the realities of those changes are. The changes that took place at First Baptist Church happened at the intersection of several different realities. And I hadn't been at First Baptist for very long before I realized that
there isn't enough money to pay for all of these blocks. There isn't enough money to pay for all this square footage. There isn't enough money to pay for all of these personnel. First Baptist Church is a massive church, thousands of people on Sunday morning, millions of dollars in budget. But our financial obligations cannot be sustained even with those kinds of resources.
First of all, there were massive problems that had been brewing for decades at our church. Another reality was my installation as the senior pastor at First Baptist Church and the burden I had for leadership as I came to this place. This goes to show you that change in ministry is always happening at the personal level as God is raising up new people and releasing other people, and as the dynamics of that ministry are changing over the course of time. I want to tell you about my personal journey to becoming the senior pastor at First Baptist Church and how important that was in the changes that ultimately happened here. From the moment I first felt God's call to Christian ministry, I only ever wanted to be a pastor, and in fact, I only ever wanted to be a pastor of the small church where I got saved.
I was a pastor for about 7 or 8 years when I found out that actually where God was leading was not in the direction of pastoral ministry at all, but was in the direction of becoming a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I did that for several years when I realized that it wasn't just that, but God's plan for my ministry was to lead a parachurch ministry. And after I was a professor and an executive director for a little while, I found out that what God was actually doing and where He was actually leading me in ministry was to come to First Baptist Church. And I never saw any of that coming. The only thing I ever wanted to do was be a pastor of the little church where I got saved and actually turned out to be the first church where I served as pastor. That's all I ever wanted to do. One of the greatest honors of my life is to serve the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors as executive director. I'm so passionate about this ministry because I served for years as a local church pastor and had a front row seat in the counseling room. And I know what it is to walk with hurting and troubled people down a difficult road to change. And I also know what it is to experience the joy of seeing troubled people experience that change by the grace of Jesus Christ. At ACBC, we want to equip men and women to use the scriptures to lay hold of the grace of Jesus to help people know what it is to change. I am excited to be able to lead ACBC at this point as they do their work of certification.
It was in that role as professor at Southern Seminary and as the leader of that parachurch ministry that I got introduced to First Baptist Church. In 2012, the pastors and leadership at First Baptist Church had made a decision that they wanted to become a biblical counseling church. And so they reached out to me to help them with that. I had been the professor of some of the pastors who had taken my classes at Southern Seminary, and they were familiar with the biblical counseling ministry that I was leading. So they reached out to me in hopes that ACBC could partner with First Baptist Church to help them transition to become a biblical counseling church. That partnership started in 2012, and it's in that relationship that I got to know the leaders of First Baptist Church.
Growing up as a Christian in the SBC is to appreciate the legacy of First Baptist Church, Jacksonville, Florida. It is an honor to be here with you. I so appreciate this church. I so appreciate this conference. I so appreciate the leadership of your pastor. In fact, to be candid with you, I feel a little overwhelmed as I look out at you and am here at this church and speaking on this topic after this choir. In the midst of all these wonderful speakers that are here at this conference, I feel a little bit like Eeyore at a motivational speakers convention. But
I got to know the pastors. I came to First Baptist a couple of times a year and would preach in their church and would speak at the biblical counseling conferences hosted at the church. Developed a really great and tender relationship with the leadership at the time. In 2015, Trey Brunson, a pastor on staff at First Baptist Church, who was the son of the senior pastor, Mac Brunson, invited me to come to Jacksonville to meet with his dad, Dr. Brunson, and with John Blunt, the executive pastor of the church, to talk about a potential job. Encouragement for busy dads on this edition of Truth and Love. I'm Heath Lambert, and you're listening to Truth and Love, a podcast of the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, where we seek to provide biblical solutions for the problems that people face. It is the week of Father's Day, and we are happy on the podcast this week to be honoring dads, and we actually want to try to help dads. Our guest on the podcast this week is Dr. Mac Brunson, who is the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. And I am excited to have him on the podcast this week to talk about ministering to busy dads, because he has been one. And in fact, I would want you to know very personally something that I've said to him before, that in 2015, when he asked me to join him in the ministry here at First Baptist, I said yes. And one of the reasons I said yes is because his son Trey is a good friend of mine. And his son Trey has nothing but wonderful things to say about his dad. Trey grew up with his dad, he's worked with his dad, and he loves his dad more now than he did before. And I have said to Dr. Brunson that I wanted to come work here because I knew he was a good pastor, because I knew he was a good dad. And so we are happy to have Dr. Brunson here with us this
I
week.
was not sure what that potential job
Dr.
would
Brunson,
be. And so when I showed up at that meeting with Mac Brunson and John Blunt, I was surprised by what they said to me. You've heard from John Blunt on a previous episode of this podcast, but John was the executive pastor and right-hand man to Mac Brunson, the senior pastor at First Baptist, and trusted advisor during almost all of Dr. Brunson's tenure as senior pastor. John was one of the three of us at the meeting, and I'll let him tell you the story of what happened as we had breakfast that day.
Yeah, our intention was always to bring you here. The intention of that meeting was to talk about you joining Mac as a co-pastor, which was going to lead to a transition over a 2 to 3 year period. There were not solid rock plans in place, but the idea was to bring in a younger man, work together, run together, serve the Lord together over a period of time, but the baton would be passed. And we were in the hunt for that person and had been for some time. At that meeting, I think we shared our summary of where we thought the church was, Mac's desire to have a co-pastor and to lead to a transition, and a real interest in you as a leader coming to work with us. We had asked ACBC to come here some months prior because we were going through a transition in that we wanted to become a counseling church. We'd always had a counseling ministry, but we needed that to change. We wanted to be a biblical counseling church, and ACBC was our method for getting that accomplished. And so when we initially began talking to you, it was with you coming in to help us build out that counseling ministry, but that was an initial start. As you and Mac began to get to know one another, work together, the church began to get to know you. He likened it to leading the way and preparing the way ahead of you so that you could follow in his footsteps. And so that was the beginning. The idea was the beginning of a transition where you would come and work with him in that role of counseling leader, but with an understanding, which became an agreement that you would ultimately move into that transition role and co-pastor for a season, then move into the senior pastor role that you and he would invert roles. He was the senior pastor and he would become the associate pastor, so that you would invert responsibilities and he would continue to remain a part of the preaching pastorate here, but that you would have the full leadership of the church going forward, and he would be there to support you and work with you in that.
I left that breakfast meeting overwhelmed with a lot to think about, with a lot to pray about, and with a lot to consider with our trusted friends and loved ones. But the long and the short of it is that in January of 2016, my family came to First Baptist Church. I came with preaching responsibilities, with staff oversight, and with a charge to help build out the biblical counseling ministry. I came as the associate pastor with a view towards transitioning to the senior pastor role. And I can describe the next 18 months from January of 2016 to becoming the co-pastor at the church in basically three separate categories. The first happened from January to September of 2016, and that was our arrival and really falling in love with First Baptist Church. It took just a couple of weeks for First Baptist Church to stop being just a big church and to start being a group of people that we loved with all our hearts. My wife and I quickly realized that we loved these people and loved this church more than any church we'd ever been a part of, and we were thrilled to be here.
I want you to know that of all the places in the whole world I could be, I wouldn't rather be any place but here. Over the last 2.5 years, you have become our family. You have become our home. And I love you, and my family loves you. And we want to see what God is going to do in this city as we unite our hands together and move forward into the future for what God has.
The second step happened from September of 2016 to August of 2017. That was a critical period of formalizing the pastoral transition with Dr. Brunson. In fact, Dr. Brunson and I had such a close relationship and worked so well together that we eventually quit speaking about a transition where he would stop being the senior pastor and I would start being the senior pastor, to talking about a time of service together as co-pastors. This was a unique arrangement, but it wasn't unique as far as the history of First Baptist Church had been concerned, who had known many co-pastors in their years of faithfulness and in their years of explosive growth. And it didn't feel odd to me and Dr. Brunson, who had a very close working relationship together.
Now was the right time for First Baptist to go back to this model that has worked for it for so many years. So that's what we did. If you were not here, if you've heard, I wanted you to hear from me what the church took action on this past Sunday. And I'm glad Dr. Lambert is here, thrilled that he's a part of our church, and he's also a part now of the senior pastor staff.
And what I would want everybody to know is what an honor it is for me to be here serving with Dr. Brunson. And I think it's important that people know that this has been your plan and your heart, and that as this came to the church, it came to the church after a long period of reflection. It came to the church after Dr. Brunson's request to the trustees that this happen and their unanimous approval of that request, after his request to the deacons that this happen and their unanimous approval of that request, and then it came to the church. I think maybe it would help people for you to understand, as this has been a process that's been going on for such a long period of time in your mind, there were sorts of two things that happened here. One is the decision to enter into this relationship with me, and the other is to enter into this relationship now. How would you answer those?
Well, I've wanted to do this for some time, long before I even knew you. But back in 2015, I called you, met with you before you came here, and this is what we talked about, that at the right time we would make this move. So Dr. Lambert came here with the understanding that one day I would ask him to step into this position.
And so from that September of 16 to August of 2017, we transitioned from thinking he would stop being the senior pastor and I would start, to this would be something that we would do together. And then, of course, in September of 2017, the church approved the plan for me to be a co-pastor. And Dr. Brunson and I served together as co-pastors until he left in the spring of 2018, when the Lord called him to a different pastoral ministry.
Now, until I walk out that door, I'm still your co-senior pastor, and I have a word of admonition. And the admonition is this, from Solomon, Proverbs: when whisperings cease, and the upset goes away. Now, let me just say one or two things. I know this seems sudden to everybody, but 8 months ago, I knew God had ended my ministry here. That was not anything new. I'd known it for months. My wife and I both, through great times of prayer together, understood that.
But that's essentially, in a nutshell, the way my transition worked to become senior pastor at First Baptist. Over my first 2 years at First Baptist, I slowly started to notice problems. One of my limitations as a leader is that I'm not a quick study. It takes me months to discover what really effective leaders can discover in just a few moments. But over those months and years that I was getting adjusted to life at First Baptist, I came to see a number of problems that slowly started to sink in. I want to let you know some of the problems that I could not deny that were overwhelming and were requiring a context for change. One of those overwhelming problems was an absolute evacuation of members. Back then, First Baptist Church was losing a large family a week. Think of a family of 4 or a family of 5 leaving every week.
Well, you notice that, especially on Sunday night, you have a huge auditorium with a skeleton crew present. And that was evident almost immediately after 2000, 99. We joined in 98, and every year you could see the numbers smaller and smaller and smaller. In Sunday school, what we saw, I started teaching around 2000, there would be consolidation of classes. When I first started teaching J.C. Parker's class, the next year, the class which was 40 was suddenly 30, and then a couple of years it was 20, and then a couple of years later it was combined with another class that had 15 in it. So I saw a lot of consolidation of Sunday school classes. So I knew the numbers were going down. I never asked the question, but it was obvious.
Some years during the period of First Baptist's decline, we lost dozens of people. Other years, we lost hundreds of people. But the long and the short of it was that in just over 10 years, over 60% of people had left the church by 2018. That's an evacuation of members that is completely unsustainable. We also had an evacuation of givers. It wasn't just that people were walking out the door, but the ability to fund ministry was going out the door with them. A few years before I came to First Baptist Church, there was a remarkably successful fundraiser that raised millions of dollars to go towards the church. It was very successful, but something amazing happened after that money was received. Within 2 years after that successful fundraiser, most of the large givers never gave to our church again. In fact, a few years after the fundraiser, 55 of the top 100 givers had left the church or quit giving. That was an evacuation of millions of dollars that left the church budget in just a few years. Another undeniable problem was a massive staff. When I got here, First Baptist Church had over 220 employees, all occupying positions that had been created before the mass exodus had begun. These team members were siloed, they were in competition with one another, and as I'll explain later, they were doing jobs that just didn't need to be done anymore at a church of First Baptist's current size. First Baptist also had created a school that was experiencing problems. I want to be clear, it's a wonderful school. My kids attended that school and they attend that school today. I'm a huge supporter of that school and I am a huge supporter of Christian education. But the school was experiencing space limitations. They were needing to grow as a school, but they didn't have in our downtown campus fields and courts where they could play and have an expanding school. And there were other financial problems, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that were created by the school. Another problem were facilities problems. Our facilities were absolutely huge. First Baptist Church was on 12 city blocks using multiple buildings that were multiple stories high, 4 parking garages, and navigating our campus was impossible. It was impossible for senior adults. It was impossible for visitors. It was impossible for young families. In fact, Richard Lucas currently serves First Baptist Church as our pastor of reaching and teaching. And he describes an overwhelming response that he and his family had when they first came to First Baptist Church for him to begin his pastoral ministry job.
When I came here, we had 4 kids. Literally the first week, the first Sunday, I didn't even know how to find where my kids are supposed to go to Sunday school. So they were on 4 different blocks.
Yeah.
And even
different floors on different blocks.
Yeah, and I had 2 kids in middle school, and only one of them was going to the middle school building. Another one went another block down the street, down in the basement somewhere, and they were supposed to just find their own way around. So it didn't even make sense from a ministry standpoint. But financially, we didn't need the space. So we had, even just around what was then the children's building, just walking through there, just tons of empty space, unused, and hadn't been used for a long time, and stuff stored up there, and no one maintaining that. The admin building was just dirty, not maintained well, looked run down, felt run down. You go to adult Sunday school classrooms, there's a ton of classrooms, so we had lots of space, but none of them looked very nice. Main auditorium was just big and cavernous. We didn't use most of it.
Our facilities were completely unusable to even a normal family just needing to get to church and get their family to childcare and get back to their car by the time it was all done. Perhaps most significantly, First Baptist Church back then was absolutely on the brink of financial ruin. There were several factors that came to play in this. First, we had a massive problem with deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is work that needs to be done, but work you don't do because you can't afford it. It's not renovations. It's not improvements. It's work that must be done for the facilities to function, but you can't afford to do it. So in that year, that's when I'm like bringing the trustees up to speed on this deferred maintenance analysis that we'd done and all this kind of thing. In the fall of 19 is when I announced to the church what I called behind the scenes the right size measures, to right size the staff, right size property, right size budget. In all those years of decline, the church had never really trimmed its sails in terms of all of the resources they were using. So I announced that plan in September of 2019. An initial response was encouraging. And then, as I stated right here, everything started to go wrong. I mean, everybody that had a grievance came out of the woodwork. That's when a lot of these lies that I was fact-checking you on a minute ago started coming out. And 2020, late 2019 and 2020 turned into a real bad season.
Crucible.
So tell me about your experience of that season.
What I remember is you called me and asked me if we could meet for breakfast one morning. And we met at Panera in San Marco. And you laid out this plan of basically this is where we are. It is not sustainable. I don't think that was lost on any of us. But when you actually put pen to paper and say, here's what's really going on, and this is where we are, it's a realization that it's not sustainable. You laid out the plan of going to a single block and all those details. And I had initial reservations just from the standpoint of I don't know that we necessarily want to rebuild and go back in when we've already got functioning things, but bygones be bygones, and we all know what's happened since then. But I thought it's a great plan. We now have a vision going forward, whereas we didn't have a vision. As we talked about earlier, we were comfortable with where we were. Where we are is fine. We'll just make it happen like we've always made it happen. We've got plenty of room to do whatever we need to do. It was ignorance of where we were. So I remember having that meeting, and you were going to announce that at some later point, and you eventually did over the coming weeks. And there was some excitement. There was some trepidation.
At First Baptist Church, there were air conditioners that needed replacing, air conditioners that needed repair. In facilities the size of First Baptist Church, we're using massive air conditioning units called chillers that require $250,000 to replace. And some of these buildings will have 3 and 4 chillers apiece. We had buildings that required 3 chillers. That's $750,000. 3 chillers, and 2 of them were out. And so whole buildings are running off 1 chiller. And when that goes, there's not going to be any air conditioning in Florida, which you really need to do ministry. We had elevators that were out of service, making it impossible for people with disabilities to navigate our facilities.
Well, the first time I became aware of it when I was a trustee in 2017, and we would go over the financials twice a month. And we were having difficulty at that time balancing, having enough money to pay for all the expenses. And I remember, every meeting, facilities was just, it was just out of whack. Twice a month, we would come in and, something was broken, and it was a chiller, and it was a roof that was leaking, and it was, a couple $100,000 here and a couple $100,000 there. And we just couldn't get a handle on the amount of repairs and maintenance that needed to be done on this place. And so it was obvious that, we were in a decline.
We had failing electrical systems, roofs that were leaking. We had black mold growing in our buildings. We had condemned and dangerous buildings. We had sound systems that were more than a decade past their end of life. Deferred maintenance is debt. It's money that you borrow against yourself, and it's particularly deadly debt because you don't ever have to pay it back. There's no deadline to pay it back. You can just keep adding it and adding it and adding it, and nobody ever comes to pay the bill.
I commissioned a deferred maintenance study and asked a firm to come in and go through our crawl spaces and get up on the roofs and walk down the hallways and open up the closets and look at all of our facilities and tell us what we need to do with regard to our deferred maintenance. I asked them 3 questions. I said, I want you to tell me what it's going to cost to fix everything that needs fixing. And they came back and they said, in order to fix everything, you have a deferred maintenance bill of $37 million.
Nobody had that money. We also had other expenses that we could not afford. We had made commitments to our ministry partners, missionaries across the world that we couldn't afford. We had made financial commitments to the school that we couldn't afford. This was what I was talking about a few minutes ago. Our church was regularly subsidizing the expense of the school, depending on the year, anywhere from $750,000 to $1.2 million each year. That means people in our congregation were giving their money to go towards the advance of the gospel, but were instead underwriting a school. Listen, a school is a valuable Christian ministry and needs to be funded, but it's also fundamentally dishonest for a church to ask for money to fund its operations and then refer that money to a school. We just couldn't afford it. And then on top of all that, we had our monthly expenses that we couldn't afford to pay anymore. Giving had declined to such an extent that we could not pay our monthly bills. It wasn't just a deferred maintenance loan that we were getting into, but we had to open up a line of credit and were borrowing anywhere from $100,000 to $125,000 a month just to make payroll. When I became senior pastor, that number was at $700,000 and growing each month. When you add up all of that money, all of those expenses, First Baptist Church had $90 million of bills it could not pay. Now, I don't know if you have ever experienced a $90 million problem, but I hadn't before I got here, and it was overwhelming. We were on the brink of financial ruin. We needed $90 million that we didn't have, and nobody had a plan to get. More than all that, people were also just defeated. This was a church that had seen the miracle of downtown Jacksonville. They knew what a growing church looked like, and when they saw this church, they saw a church that was losing ground and was dying. One long-term member is Brent Blanchett. He's been a member of First Baptist Church since the 1990s. He was here during the glory days, and he witnessed the decline, and here's how he described what he saw.
So a lot happens in 5 years, and the incremental changes that take place over 5 years happen suddenly for someone who's been away for 5 years and then suddenly is back.
So what'd you notice?
Church attendance was way down. The main auditorium was looking pretty bare, particularly in the balcony section. In every church, you have people that like to camp on their pews, right? And it's maybe not the best behavior, but it's present in almost every church I've been to. And it used to be that way with almost every single pew in the church. Like, you're talking the back row, top of the balcony, corner of the auditorium. People wanted that spot, and now, I mean, take it. Like, you sit up there, you wouldn't be within 50 feet of another human being.
Here's what I want you to know. The problem was far more serious than anyone knew. People were leaving through the 20-teens at such a rate that we were less than 8 years away from zero attendance on Sunday morning, and we were less than 5 years away from complete financial insolvency, and something had to give. When I got here in 2018, I saw an iceberg and I jerked the wheel to avoid disaster. That jerking of the wheel, that kind of change, is as hard as it is necessary. It's necessary because you don't want to sink, but it's hard. When you do it, people will think you can't drive. Folks are going to fall over, they're going to fall off, and they're going to get hurt. It's better than a wreck. It's better than a disaster, but it's not pretty. In fact, it's ugly, it's hard, it's brutal, it is intensely and personally painful.
Here is the most maybe important question I'm going to ask you. So you are, again, you've got a wonderful heart, you're a Christian woman, you're in ministry, but you're not a pastor, you've never wanted to be a pastor, you're never going to go and try to run a ministry and burn stuff down and build it back. You're just a normal person. You love Jesus, you want to serve Jesus, you want to help people. As a normal person who says the trouble started in 2017 and ended in 2021, I want you to tell me what happened. I want you to tell the story from your perspective of, when I'm talking about the trouble starting and ending, here's what I'm talking about. And here's the beginning, here's the climax, and here's the end. What happened in those four years?
Honestly, I don't know. What happened is crisis after crisis after crisis.
Yeah.
Which is why when you asked me about this, when you asked me about recording this, I thought I won't be any good at it because I don't remember the things that happened, which is funny because during the time, over the course of the 4 years, every time something big happened, which was all the time, I thought, I will never forget this. This doesn't happen to people. This is crazy circumstances. This is like 4 things at once in one day. And I was like, I'll never forget this. So I didn't write stuff down because I was like, there's no need. Like, it's etched into my mind. But then when it happens the next week and it's something totally different, but just as hard, then they all start to blend together and you just forget them because it's just one hard thing after the other.
Do you remember how I always used to say, I always said this, if we were at any normal church, what we're dealing with right now would be the biggest story of any 5-year period.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that? But this is just like this afternoon, and tomorrow morning it'll be something else.
Yeah, no, honestly, it was every day there was something, but every week there was a crisis for such a sustained period of time. Like, so I haven't even gotten to the like high points and starting and stuff, but my overarching feeling during that time was how does this keep happening?
And that is what we're going to talk about next week